The pandemic has put the people of our country under enormous stress as we live in fear and uncertainty that is surrounding us. And for many of our people, the stress had brought us to a boiling point. We see it on our screening data, but more importantly, we're seeing it on our TV screens, on social media, in the words of our public officials, in the stories that are coming to light in ways we haven't seen and with intensity we haven't witnessed, at least since the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Growing up Black in the United States of America can be an incredibly traumatic experience. The inexcusable and violent death of George Floyd, as he begged for help, has evoked both our rage and frustration. And like other similar incidents in the past, this has brought out into the open the stress and trauma faced on a daily basis by so many people of color who live in our country. People of color and all those whose lives have been marginalized by those in power experience life differently from those whose lives have not been devalued. They experience overt racism and bigotry far too often, and they shoulder a mental health burden that is deeper than what others face. When you have to live in fear for your life just for being accused of passing a bogus $20 bill, you can't be mentally healthy at the same time. As the son of civil rights leader, Dr. Cleveland Sellers, our next guest had a front row seat to this reality growing up. And as an adult, he has followed in the footsteps of his father in his tireless commitment to public service, while championing policies to address issues ranging from education and poverty to preventing domestic violence and childhood obesity. Bakari Sellers made history in 2006 when, at just 22 years old, he defeated a 26-year incumbent state representative to become the youngest member of the South Carolina state legislature and the youngest African-American elected official in the nation. In 2014, Sellers won the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor, and he is still widely considered to be a rising star within the Democratic Party and a leading voice for his generation. Sellers earned his undergraduate degree from Morehouse College, where he served as student body president, and his law degree from the University of South Carolina. Bakari has been a much sought after public speaker and has provided political and social commentary and analysis on many major national news outlets. He practices law in Columbia, South Carolina, is a CNN contributor, and now a best-selling author with the 2020 release of My Vanishing Country, a memoir. Please welcome to MHA's annual conference, Bakari Sellers.
Thank you so much. That's a great introduction. I feel like my mom wrote that. Thank you for having me.
As a matter of fact, she did. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. We really appreciate you being here. And I think we're going to have a rich conversation now. But let me start with times before you were born and ask you a little bit about an event in 1968 that I think you've talked about as helping frame your life and your belief. So in 1968, 3 people died in the Orangeburg Massacre when law enforcement personnel fired on a peaceful protest aimed at desegregating a bowling alley. Most of us never heard about this at the time. Well, one was one of your father's closest friends. So could you open just by telling us about your father, about the Orangeburg Massacre, and how that event, even though you weren't even going to be born for almost 2 decades, has shaped so much of your life?
Sure. So first, let me just say that my mom and dad always tell me the 2 most important words in the English language are the words thank you, and they're not nearly said enough. So I want to start by simply saying thank you for having me at this conference. This is an awesome experience and an awesome opportunity for me. You're talking about February 8th, 1968, a date in history that the history books now record as being called the Orangeburg Massacre. But let's go back to 1968 and understand the context, the full historical context. Tom Brokaw refers to 1968 as boom, because he said it was the year that the country was on fire. We not only had the Orangeburg Massacre in February of 68, but you had the assassination of Martin Luther King in April, and you had the assassination of RFK the early part of that summer, and you also had many soldiers coming home from Vietnam. And so there was a great deal of tension, particularly throughout the South. My father was a member of SNCC, served as the National Field Director, National Program Secretary, served with or under both John Lewis and Stokely Carmichael. He was there right after SNCC's founding and had done things like go to Philadelphia, Mississippi to lead search missions for the bodies of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. February 8th in 1968, however, is the most deadly civil rights demonstration this country's ever seen. And it's not so much the tragedy that 3 young men were shot that night and killed: Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton. It's not so much the tragedy that 28 others were wounded, including my father, when state troopers fired deadly double-act buckshots into the group of protesting students. It's not so much that my father was actually arrested and charged with 5 felony counts, looking at a maximum of 75 years in prison. And it's not so much the tragedy that my father was actually housed on death row while his bond was denied. And it's not so much the tragedy that his indictment was backdated from February 8th to February 6th. All the officers who fired shots into the group of students were charged. They were all found not guilty. My father was subsequently recharged with rioting, and he became the first and only one-man riot in the history of this country and ended up serving a year in prison. And it's not so much the tragedy that my sister, her middle name is Abadame, which is Swahili. It means born while father is away, because my sister was born while my father was in prison. But I think the greatest tragedy, as you stated kind of in your question, is that people don't know this history. I try to live so that those lives that were lost that evening were not in vain. And just as my father lived for Emmett Till and Medgar Evers and Jimmy Lee Jackson, and the list goes on and on and on, and Henry Smith and Samuel Hammond and Delano Middleton, I find myself ensuring that I give not only those individuals some voice in life, but also, the George Floyd, Breonna Taylors, Ahmaud Arbery's, Walter Scott's, Keith Lamont Scott's, Alton Sterling, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice. That's my frame. And I'm a child of the civil rights movement. And so everything I look at politically, culturally, and socially, I look at through the prism of that very rich civil rights history.
You've crossed paths with so many of the icons of the civil rights movement. You mentioned Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, Julian Bond, Andrew Young, and others. And it seems like most of the people whose paths you crossed chose to be inside players, working to reform the system from within, while others were arguing that the whole racist system needed to be torn down from the outside. You've written that you chose the inside path. Even though the community you grew up in, which was Denmark, South Carolina, has suffered so much under the current system. Could you tell us why?
So yeah, that's a good question. And not everybody. Stokely would, if Stokely was here, he would look at you with the clear side eye when you said that he was working within the system, because he did anything but. But yeah, Julian Bond ran for office. Julian Bond, actually, I write in my book, Julian had one of the more legendary races in 1986 for the 5th congressional seat of Atlanta. And, I actually assert that if there was a cleaner campaign run, then Julian Bond would have been the United States congressman, not John Lewis. And you talk about Marion Barry, who, with whatever faults individuals want to attribute to him, created an entire new Black middle class in Washington, D.C., and is one of the greatest mayors this country's ever seen. I learned from those individuals, and understanding the lessons of Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, I decided that I wanted to run for office and be a change agent from within, deconstructing these systems of oppression that we live under. There are people who want to tear the systems down and apply pressure from the outside. Both of these things are necessary, and one is not more important than the other. The work that I do is just as important and equal to the work that Black Lives Matter does. My friends like DeRay and Brittany Packnett, who apply pressure on these systems from the outside, and vice versa. And so I fell in love with politics, as many do when they actually get involved and engaged in the process. It's something you can't really get off of you. And so I decided that was where I wanted to be a part of the change in South Carolina. It was an uphill battle, to say the least, and one that I'm still fighting even today.
Well, it's one that I sure hope you'll win one of these days soon. Thinking back on this, I want to tell you my first recollection of Julian Bond was when I was 15 years old at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. We've just had the 2 conventions in the last couple of weeks now, so it's on everybody's mind. when there was a move that started to nominate him for vice president from the floor. And I remember, his floor speech. He was in among all the delegates at that point, saying he was going to have to decline the nomination because he had not yet reached the age at which he could accept a nomination like that. And he was 28, I think, or 29 at the time. So these people who were changing society and really were young and kind of made these decisions to work as best they could, like you, when you were quite young.
So let me just chime in quickly. I mean, people ask me often, and I say this without any hesitation. I tell people that I much rather be a Julian Bond than a Barack Obama, and I want to be clear because you won't find any greater fan of the 44th president than myself. But what I've realized, though, is that coming forward and being a part of a system, running for office in a Southern legislature with that civil rights experience and the things that Uncle Julian, as I call him, was able to accomplish and able to do, even through his chairmanship of the NAACP, and subsequently being one of the best teachers to ever walk through Charlottesville, Virginia, at the University of Virginia. I just admire him so much. And we can't say the name Stokely too much during this interview because my son is actually named after Stokely Carmichael, and he will randomly appear in this presentation. So we have to be quiet when we say that name out loud.
Well, that's fine. We'll be prepared for that. And now, and when you mentioned SNCC before, I was thinking, I hope everybody knows that was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and not, many people, I think, again, aren't as familiar with these organizations and how much they influenced and affected the 1960s and much of what happened in a positive way subsequent to that, including, Stokely Carmichael, who, yes, I agree, was not one who was most inclined to work inside the system. But again, you were, and you and I have a few things in common. So we were both elected to our state houses when we were very young, although I was much older than you, 25, not 22. We both initially ran against popular, entrenched incumbents. We both leaned heavily on our natural constituencies when they were told that they only had a certain place that they could have, and these were not the places that we were necessarily allowed into. And in our political careers, we both took risks. I am pretty sure, the only white elected official in my state in 1988 who actively supported Jesse Jackson for president. And we have also both been diagnosed with anxiety. So do you think it's something about politicians in general, or just young ones who get into things we wouldn't wish on our worst enemy, that anxiety is part of our lives?
Well, I don't know. I do speak to a lot of my young colleagues around the country, whether or not it's Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin, Malcolm Kenyatta in Pennsylvania, Ted James in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Just have this kind of nexus of young elected officials. And we talk about things like anxiety. We talk about the importance of having people to lean on. When I got elected in 2006, there weren't that many young elected officials at the time. In fact, I was a part of a young elected official network that included two superstars, Andrew Gillum and my senator from Arizona, Senator Sinema. I was like, my names are escaping me this morning. But yeah, we lean on each other. We learn how to talk to each other. I think that my anxiety, I'm pretty certain, comes from a lot of the pain and trauma associated with the experiences of my father and mother, and that being passed down. I think a lot of it has to deal with the onus I put on myself to kind of live for others. I highlight in my book, I write about two occurrences. The first, probably the one that helped me identify the anxiety at a very early age, was my good friend dying. He was slightly older than I. He was the summer of his going into ninth grade. He died on the football field. I was going into eighth grade. And when you're that young and you realize that you lose that sense of invincibility, you begin to worry and become anxious. And that coupled with the experiences of my mom and her mental health issues stemming from, the trauma of not just being a Black woman in America, but also being the wife of a civil rights hero and incarcerated, and those struggles kind of coalesced into, I always call it me getting caught in my head. Ayala Van Zant, who I speak to often, she says that's not quite the best way to put it, Bakari. It's when you're in your head with no adult supervision. And I said, yes, ma'am, that's probably a better way to describe anxiety. And so it's something that I live with, something that it was cathartic in my book to write and share with the world that I do have anxiety. But it's something that I found great comfort in my wife and being able to be a partner and deal with the angst of life, and just makes me a better person. I think it also makes us better elected officials too, because we focus on ensuring a better future for all, and we work damn hard to push in that direction. And we, in the words of the great American poet Christopher Wallace, also known as Biggie Smalls, had no idea I would be quoting Biggie Smalls this morning at Mental Health America, but we sleep when we die, and so we put everything and we put our all in that passion, and it drives us to try to make sure that we realize those not so tangible ideals that you and I both ascribe to, not just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but words like love, truth, justice, peace, hope, and give those words real meaning and make them, those not so tangible words, feel real to us all.
I think it means so much that you root your anxiety in childhood, the death of a friend, and then that fear of death that you've written about, and also the fear of failure that I think also does motivate a lot of us, particularly.
That's motivating, man. It's people like, so in the chapter, and you know this, but for those who haven't read the book, in the chapter, it's called Anxiety, a Black Man's Superpower, because we talk about the fear of death and the fear of failure and how those things just push you and push you. And, they're so intertwined. I don't want to die before I complete my life's work. And there's just still so much out there to do. And so that builds on your anxiety. And it just, you just try to, I know so many Black men who deal with mental health issues. And for far too long, we've only believed that we could talk to our barber, right? That's most Black men's therapists. But we have to do a better job of communicating with others and building a network around us. Charlemagne the God, who just got inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame, who is one of the largest urban, I guess is the term they use, radio DJs in the country. He's in over 100 markets. Wrote a book where he talked about that, and we both talk about it in our respective books and our friendship. And we go out and we talk to other Black men about the issues that they may be dealing with, and say there's no shame in being able to talk about these things. In fact, if you're not mentally healthy, then you can't do anything in this movement, and we need all hands on deck.
Yeah, and it's become such a common experience in the pandemic as well. A little while ago, I was talking to Dr. Josh Gordon at NIMH and talking about the data that we're seeing from our MHA screening program. It's an online screening program at MHAscreening.org. And since the beginning of the pandemic, anxiety is off the charts. And anxiety and depression, we've seen 250,000 new cases. So many people are experiencing anxiety now and dealing with it for the first time. And so I think it's really helpful, for people to hear that they're not alone, right? Even though they've been lonely these last few months, and that it is a common experience, and it is something that we can talk about. And it is something that by talking about it, we can actually, help ourselves and help others to let them know that, these are extraordinary and unusual times. And, we can accept that.
Yeah, and I think that it's important for us to understand why individuals may have some level of anxiety during this time frame. And I think we have to unpack that. We just can't say that people are suffering from anxiety during this time, because people will just take it, all right, people going through stuff, we all going through stuff, but we have to unpack that. And I think that when you are, particularly in Black and brown communities, where you were disproportionately affected by this virus, where you are a small percent of the population, but you find yourself dying at obscene rates. But not only that, Black females are usually and have been over the past decade plus the fastest growing small business owners in the country. But what we're seeing is that this virus is sucking the wealth, the little bit of wealth that we've been able to attain in this country, sucking it out of our communities. You overlay that with the systemic injustices that we face day in and day out. And I'm not just talking about criminal justice. That's things that we are now seeing with our eyes. America's awakening to that fact. But I'm talking about educational injustice where children are punished because of the zip code that they're born into. I'm talking about just this week, they announced a $600 million settlement in Flint, Michigan. But if I told you that there were 100 cities in the United States that had a higher lead concentration in their water than Flint, Michigan, you probably wouldn't believe me. I'm talking about food deserts where you can't go 1 to 2 miles and get fresh fruits and vegetables. I'm literally describing my home, right? And so when you have this virus and you have the two-pronged devastation, not just the health aspect, but also the economic aspect, and you overlay that with the societal ills around the issues of race that we haven't dealt with, then it's no wonder that people have anxiety. And so I think it's necessary that we take that extra step and we talk about the foundation from where this comes from. And I think once we do that, we can better understand how to unravel and help people deal with the issues that they're facing.
One of the things I liked about the composition of your book is that the chapter on anxiety really comes later on in the book. So you tell your story and you tell the genesis of this story. You talk about your hometown, you talk about your family, you talk about all these things, and then you bring in anxiety and reframe it a little bit later on about the anxiety. And I'm wondering, I picked up a little in your last answer about why I think it might have been important to you to do it in that order. But could you talk a little bit more about just why putting the frame that way instead of having the first chapter being I live with anxiety, and then also just talk about why it was important for you to speak publicly about it.
So it was twofold. One, I wanted to kind of show and lay the foundation of where I'm from, my background, my history, the highs and lows, because I wanted people to be able to see that as a child of the movement, understanding that that trauma, right, the perpetual trauma of being Black in this country. And I wanted people to be able to see me through some successes and some failures, being the youngest Black elected official in the country, being the youngest person to ever win a statewide party nomination for lieutenant governor here, losing that race. I wanted people to be able to kind of understand the inner workings of not just my mind, but my heart. And then I wanted people to be able to see that, yes, this is my whole truth. And you need to know that this is an issue that I deal with on a very, very much daily basis, right? But for me in particular, I wanted white folk, when they read this book, to get a sense of understanding of the Black experience and the totality thereof. And I wanted Black folk, when they read this book, to get a sense of pride and to feel a part of my story in them, letting them know that we may not all get there at the same time, but we will get there together. And so I just, it was dual purpose, but it all ended up coming out in the same fashion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it actually makes a lot of sense. And for me, actually reading it, I think I had both of those experiences, some greater understanding and the ability, frankly, to link it to, certain, things that are in my past or my family's past, or issues that people face that, in past generations, that it's been easier for them perhaps to overcome because of their race, but also the pride. I mean, that you're right. I mean, when my kids read this book, my kids are all mixed race, I would think that that's how they would feel. And you're just about the same age as all of my kids. And so it's important to me that they hear voices, from their own generation who are able to talk openly about challenges and openly about what's happening in terms of their health and mental health, and also who are just forward looking and thinking, in ways and in talking in ways to be so helpful to people. So I think the book worked for me, and if that's an advertisement for others to buy the book and read the book, it's a real easy read. I hope they will.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let me turn to something else, and I want to talk broadly to healthcare for a little bit. We have a little bit of time left, and again, I don't want to take all of your stories away from you, but you've had a lot of direct contact in your family with the healthcare delivery system.
Yeah.
And as do I, that it's been a lot of policy decisions that have been made over generations that have undermined access to healthcare in general, including for people in the community in which you grew up. So how do we fix this? How do we convince people who may still be persuadable that they need to be voting, their self-interest, and particularly around issues of health and mental health from my perspective, and not necessarily be fooled by all the snake oil salespeople who are out there?
Yeah, I don't have the answer. One of the things I learned about being a lawyer is you got to let people know when you don't have the answer. I wish if I could figure out how to convince people to vote their interest, their self-interest, then I would have the golden key. But you hit on something in the healthcare delivery system. I am not someone who focuses on the complicated intricacies of our healthcare system. I believe in universal healthcare. I believe that we have to get there. I believe in building on the Affordable Care Act, et cetera, politically. But I'm very much focused on access. Even if we have Medicare for all, that's cool and all, but we still don't have a hospital in a lot of poor rural towns or counties, especially throughout the South. So you talked about my interaction with the healthcare delivery system. There are three. The first is in 2010, while we were having this expansion of Medicaid debate, et cetera, but in 2010, my county lost its hospital. It completely shut down. And what does that mean? It's not only the fact that we now have to travel 30 to 45 minutes to the nearest hospital, not just that. So if you have a heart attack, you're just dead, right? I mean, that is what it is. To quote the 45th president of the United States, it is what it is, right? But it's also our number one or two largest employer. And not only that, but all the small businesses, the flower shops, the small restaurants, the pharmacies that are around that hospital may also close too. So it just created a huge economic hole, a huge void in access to care. And it's happening throughout the South. It's happening that these rural hospitals are just shutting down. They're not able to sustain themselves, and no one's doing anything about it. That's first. The second thing was we had an amazing pregnancy with my twins, Sadie and Stokely. They're 19 months old now. An amazing pregnancy. We had the worst birth it was, my wife, after Sadie was born at 5:33, Stokely was born at 5:28. By 10:30, she had lost 7 units of blood. She hemorrhaged. The nurses were moving so damn slow. I had to become her number one advocate and yell and scream. I FaceTime her doctors, 3 Black women. They were able to run in. They came from their home. One had an 8-year-old. She left the garage up for the babysitter and she zoomed out. It was just it was a god awful experience. She almost died, and she spent the first 36 hours of my children's life in ICU. And that greater issue is the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. And we just saw a study that CNN ran that talked about the fact that Black women giving birth are more likely to survive if they have Black doctors. And no one is doing much about the implicit biases we have in our healthcare delivery system. And so that's number 2. And number 3, a few months later, we found out that my little girl had biliary atresia, and so she ended up on the liver transplant waiting list for 93 days, which is, you're literally watching your daughter die every single day, and there's nothing you can do. But September 1st, We're almost, we're right at that year marker where she was able to get the gift of life. But I saw in that system that if you don't have means or access, that it's very difficult to get to get that gift. And so I've seen three broken points in our healthcare delivery system, and I'm dedicating, my life to trying to fix those.
Well, I want you to succeed. I'm there with you. I'm so glad that your daughter's doing better now. That your wife's doing well. That your family is whole and healthy. And I do think that we need to understand that we cannot take these things for granted because most people don't. And most people don't have this kind of access. Most people, certainly people with mental health conditions, have suffered under segregation for some period of time without access to good quality mental health services from the earliest times they need them. And I think we do have to do better, and I hope we will. And so my final question for you today, if you've got one more minute to answer it, would be, just in general, what gives you hope?
Oh, my children, they deserve to be free. They deserve to live in a better country than the one that we have today. And so I'm very hopeful. And, I think about the history. I think about my history and my relationship to the civil rights movement, and understand that many times all they had was hope and faith. And I refuse to let anybody take that away from me. And so one day my kids will be free. And one day we will have a country that lives up to its promises for us all. And I'm excited about that day, but work like hell to get there.
Well, thank you, Bakari, for joining us today. I think you've convinced a lot of us that if you ever decide to move beyond the borders of South Carolina in your political career, that we're going to be signed up right behind you to do all we can to elevate that profile of yours and put you back into elective office. We need you. We need you doing what you're doing now. We needed you doing what you were doing then. And you've got plenty of time yet ahead of you. So don't give up on us. I think we'll realize that hope for you before we're done.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And I hope everyone enjoys the conference.
Thanks. So we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be joined on the other side by Dr. Melissa Merrick, the president and CEO of the national nonprofit Prevent Child Abuse America, where we will discuss COVID-19 and childhood trauma.